Apologize, you can continue.
Excellent. So good morning, everyone. It's now 10:02 and I'd like to call the meeting to order. And the first order of business is to ask if there are any declarations of pecuniary interest. So looking for nods or head shakes to kind of verify, validate that. So
Al,
there being none. Yes.
I'm just trying to understand what the definition of pecuniary interest. I have property that are up in Cognizant. It's vacant lots that at some point I will intend to build on those lots. Decisions that may be coming out of this planning committee may impact what I can and cannot do on those lots. Is that, am I in any conflict in making decisions specific to that may affect what I can or cannot do on these building lots?
That's a good question. We did have a code of conduct training last meeting, and some of the questions like yours, we really didn't surface. And so I'm not sure that we really were able to dig into where there is a pecuniary interest or not. But perhaps what we should be doing is, well, first of all, our clerk, Karen Way at the time, offered to field questions, perhaps either in writing, or we could bring her back again. Or we, I suppose, could ask that we have our integrity commissioner come in and kind of barrage her with a bunch of questions if there is a barrage of these. So you ask a good question. I'm not the authority on it, so I'm not going to try to put something out there that is going to be potentially incorrect. So perhaps we can ask Sydney, can you take an action item, or should we move a resolution to explore this area of potential conflict? Because I think that there's many of us who have property out here where decisions that are being made through the planning committee may have a direct impact on things that we might be able to do on our properties. And so the question then becomes, if we are involved in those kinds of decisions, does that represent a conflict of interest, or are we amassed with the many residents who are of a similar situation, and therefore our conflict is minor because it's one of a large group? So that's, I don't want to reframe Ian's question the wrong way, but I think we probably need to get some clarity on these kinds of questions.
Yeah, through the deputy chair to member Davis, I can clarify a little bit further. When we're speaking in relation to pecuniary interest, that is relating to or consisting of money. In terms of declaring a pecuniary interest in relation to your property, because all the members on this committee are property owners in the township of Georgian Bay, the committee itself is making recommendations to council in relating to provisions covering the entire township. So a lot of the recommendations are general in relation to the entire township. So that wouldn't be, you wouldn't need to declare pecuniary interest on that. If it's an application relating directly to your property or a close family member that lives in your household, that would be something you would want to declare on. Like I said, if you have a specific situation, you can email myself or the clerk, and we could provide you with a response or get you in touch with the commissioner, like Deputy Chair Hazelton stated. But does that clarify anything a little bit further?
Yeah, no, that makes a little bit more sense. So
Okay.
This committee really, like you said, Sydney, is not necessarily making decisions, but it's making recommendations that ultimately will go to council, and council is making either accepting our recommendations or not. So it's really sort of, yeah, we're not making the decision, is what you're saying. So
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bill?
Alan, Mr. Chair, I guess my kind of thought is it might be useful for Ian and Peter if they could get access to the presentation. Was that a PowerPoint, or at least substantial part of it was in a PowerPoint, I thought, with different attachments that we received ahead of time. It might be very helpful. I kind of suspect that some questions people would have, were sort of answered in that presentation. And I know Armin, for example, asked some questions, he being involved in, real estate matters and so on, asked a few questions that, the answers were helpful to everybody. So I guess my thought would be, for Ian and Peter, if that presentation could be provided, it might go a long way to answering questions.
So Sydney, can we ask you to circulate that as well as code of conduct? So one thing, if I could just go ahead, Peter.
I just wanted to say I did sit in on that presentation. It was delivered to the Committee of Adjustment 2 weeks ago, and I was able to sit in, so I have seen the presentation.
Thank you. So one of the things that has been brought to my attention when we talk about our committee, and our committee passes resolutions, and those resolutions go to council or committee of the whole, it has been suggested that even though they are just, quote, recommendations from our committee, there may be a very significant weight placed on those recommendations because of them being handed off to the planning committee and then going to council. And so I don't want to trivialize the value and the weight of those recommendations. And so I think if I can read between the lines, Ian, and what you're trying to suggest here is there may be circumstances where we as a committee make recommendations, and they are much stronger than simply a recommendation, even though they do have to be accepted and ratified by council. And therefore the duty, if you will, for avoiding conflict in our actions may be higher than what's might be considered superficial issues. So I don't know if that's helpful. Beth, did you want to add in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mr. Chair, if they don't value our opinion, what is the purpose of this committee? So I would think and hope that our recommendations do come with are considered by council.
Right. So I've heard that elsewhere as well, and so I wanted Sydney to hear that, and I think what we want to do is push the envelope a little bit in the clarification. Excuse me, because it's not simply, I mean, we asked the question about pecuniary interest, but when we look at code of conduct, it explores both pecuniary and appearances of conflict based on role and activities that you're involved in. And so although the question that still shows up on our agenda sounds very simplistic and binary of do you have pecuniary interest or not, the code of conduct takes it to a much deeper level. And so that's really what I think that question is intending. And I think it would be helpful, given the kinds of topics that we're involved in here, to dig a little deeper and get deeper answers on that. So can I leave that with you? Oh, Beth, did you want to say again?
I was just going to ask of individual members that present those committees to Sydney and maybe the Integrity Commissioner, if they can all be shared, questions and answers shared with all of us. That'd be helpful.
All righty. So moving off from the second point, third item on our agenda here is the adoption of the agenda. And before we pass the adoption of the agenda, we have one that has been circulated. Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda that anybody wanted to offer? Yes, Beth.
Sorry, was trying to find the agenda. I went on to the township website last night and I couldn't find where the agenda was, and I don't remember receiving it. Other than I received from you last night, Alan, the Zoom link that obviously is working, and that's why I'm here. But
okay, so I think what we may need to do, given that Ian, you and Peter were recent additions to the committee, and the streamlining of the notifications may not be in place yet.
Okay.
I do know that the easiest way to ensure that we're notified is to sign into the links or sign up for the links for planning committee, and then you get the information. But that may have been needed to have been done before the agenda was published. So Cindy, did you want to weigh in and offer clarification on how best to get connected with these things?
Yeah, after the meeting, I will send you instructions on how to sign up for the agenda notifications, so they will get automatically sent to your email. I have a step-by-step breakdown of how to go on our website and sign up.
Thank you.
Okay, back to you, Beth. Did you want to?
Well, Ian, just because you haven't seen the agenda doesn't mean you're missing much. I was really quite surprised that there really is no substance on this agenda. We've had a number of issues come to this committee. We've talked about priorities of issues, of which some seem to be still unsettled. What goes into the waterfront policy? What comes back to this committee? When does it come back to this committee? I had hoped that by having regular monthly meetings, which we agreed to do, that we would be tackling all of these individual lists, maybe 2 or 3 at a time. None of these are before this committee today, which is rather unfortunate. So thank you, Alan, for sending that list that we did talk about a number of meetings ago. And I think it would be worthwhile if we have time today to start, looking at that, because I'm not sure that what was sent and what was in that report necessarily reflects the priority of the items that we discussed as a committee. We all had different opinions about what was high priority, what was not. But I think we should be discussing those issues. As I say, some are to come to us, some are not, some are going into the waterfront policies. I guess the question to Jason would be, if they're in the waterfront policies, will they come back to us in draft form before they're out in the public purview for us to have input? And is there time for that input? So I like it if we have time today, because there really is nothing of substance on this agenda other than to obviously introduce our new committee members. But if we could go through some of those things today, it would be helpful.
So can I paraphrase that by saying you'd like to add a review of the items that have been assigned to the planning committee as an item of new business?
Yes, I would like. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Are there any other, and we can get into the questions you were trying to field towards Jason when we get to that item of new business. Are there any other items of new business that people would be interested in adding? There being none, can I have a mover? Hang on. Find my list of resolutions. Come on. So I need a mover for a resolution that is, be it resolved that the planning committee adopts the agenda of February 25, 2022 as amended.
Also move, Alan.
Okay, that's Ian, and seconded by Bill. You had your hand up. Cindy, can you record those items? Okay. All in favor? Show of hands. Excellent. Okay, so the first item of business is the adoption of the minutes of the planning committee of January 28, 22. So those of you who haven't received the agenda package may not be familiar with them, but you probably weren't here either. So I'll ask for those who were at the meeting or who have received the minutes, are there any errors or omissions in the minutes to consider? Beth.
Sorry, the minutes have a little bit more detail than usual, so thank you, Sydney, because I know we talked about that at the last meeting. And I noticed on one particular item, you actually name the member that has made the comments, and others you just say committee. I think it would be helpful when you record the notes that you record which committee member said which, because oftentimes we take different positions on some particular matters, and the only member that was named in all of the minutes here was member Grigatus. Just if we can do that in the future.
I will discuss with our clerk. I know that with our clerk, we did take a different direction in terms of the minutes, and I'm just following suit to her direction. I know she likes to have conversations named in the minutes as a more general stance as an entire committee. Unfortunately, yeah, I did name member Grigatus because it was hard to word it in a different way, but I will discuss this with Karen and say that it was brought up as a concern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other errors or omissions, corrections to the minutes? And there being none, so our next resolution is be it resolved that the planning committee approve the minutes of January 28th, 2022 as circulated. Can I have a mover?
I'll move that.
That would be Jack Hope, seconder. Beth, and all in favor. And we'll have that carried. Thank you. Okay, so the next item of business in our agenda is the planning committee appointment. So as I think we all understand, Michael Williams had to resign as a member and chair of the planning committee for personal reasons. And the current state is I am deputy chair, which is why I'm starting off the meeting this way. But we do need to elect a chair of the meeting, and that would be the next item of business. And so we need to begin with a nomination for chair.
I'll nominate Al Hazelton as chair of the planning committee.
Thank you. We have a seconder.
I would second that. I think I did nominate you for vice chair, Mr. Hazelton, and I certainly would second that nomination. And I don't believe there were any dissenting votes when we had that discussion at that particular meeting.
Okay, are there any other nominations to consider? I don't want to rush it. I see the train coming. Okay, shall we take a vote? I can't vote, so all those in favor of appointing me as chair? And that is carried. Okay. So next item on business is new business, and excuse me, what I would like to do, if I may, and if Sydney could give me the ability of sharing my screen, I'd like to just throw up the list of items that have been assigned to our planning committee, and we'll talk a little bit about their relative importance and the next step forward, if you will, so that we can continue to contribute as a committee to the township, recognizing that these items that have been assigned to us, this list dates back to September. Screen 2, screen 1. Just give me a sec where I want to services report. Okay. Show this. There we go. Sure. Okay. Can everybody let's make this thing bigger? Okay, can everyone see see my screen right now?
Yeah.
I'll take that as a yes. So,
That's good.
And hopefully it's somewhat readable, but we can zoom in as needed. But what I wanted to start off with is this is the list of items with current statuses as of September 24th last year. And what we see here is in the far left column are the topics that have been assigned to the planning committee. And then we see a couple other columns here. One of the key columns is the one that I'm kind of rolling my mouse up and down here, where it is the waterfront policy review scope, and is it going to be included in that scope or not? So there's a variety of items that were pulled into the waterfront policy review and may or may not be considered there. I'd like to just ask one quick question, and this is somewhat to Sydney and to Jason. When we passed the council resolution in January that approved the progress for Jason to continue with the terms of reference for this waterfront policy review, it was stated very clearly that this was fully budgeted and was a full go-ahead. We got a recent note from our director of planning suggesting that it may not be funded. So Jason, Sydney, do you have any updates on that you can share?
Let Sydney take an opportunity to speak first, Mr. Chair, but I do have potentially some additional information for committee's context. Yes.
I'm going to pass it back over to Jason. Unfortunately, I do not have an update on this item. I wasn't privy to any of the information pertaining to the budget.
Okay. So Jason, what can you tell us?
So thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand from consultations with Dr. Aspala, who unfortunately isn't able to join us today as he's on holidays, that he is presenting a further report to Planning Committee on the Waterfront Policy Review in March, based on a request that he had received from Council for additional information on the details for the work program. So the next steps for the Waterfront Policy Review are to check back in with Planning Council with those additional details. And at that time, I believe Dr. Aspila is looking for, I'm going to use the term, a final green light to proceed with the Waterfront Policy Review from Planning Council at that time.
Okay, so we can assume that we have a maybe instead of a yes for all these items that are going to the waterfront policy, because hopefully it will go ahead, but there may be some risk in it. And if it looks like I'm looking down at you when I'm looking at the screen here, it's because I've got my window of people down at my lower screen and the report up on the upper screen. Anyways, so what I think might be useful is for us to at least be aware of these items, and perhaps for Ian and Peter, these will be relatively new, but for Beth and Bill and Jack and the other members, these will be kind of well-known items. What was interesting to me as I looked through these in trying to prepare for this meeting is that they're not new items. They're items that have been discussed for quite a while. And I think what ultimately we may want to do is not so much discuss them in detail, but revisit them and understand whether they are items that we should be kind of walking away from and leaving in their current documented state, or whether we should revisit them. And if I could, what I don't want to do is I don't want to be monopolizing the conversation here, but I would like to walk through this and then let people jump in if and where they want to. And Jason, you wanted to say something?
No, I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chair. I think the only other piece of information that I may offer for committee's benefit is you are correct. This is the version of the work program that we had reviewed and discussed together in September. Working with former Chair Williams, there was a subsequent report that was brought forward to Planning Committee in November, I believe, which presented summary information on the disposition of the matters that had previously been assigned to Planning Committee. So which items went into the Waterfront Policy Review, which ones didn't, which ones were scheduled next for Council. So I do have that chart up, and I would sort of suggest it's greatly simplified. So if it is a benefit to committee, I'm happy to pull that chart up so committee members, existing and new, can understand where the sort of the various matters are going, if you will, through this roadmap.
Sure. Let's go with your screen, and I'll stop sharing. And if Sydney, you could let Jason share, that would be great.
I'm okay, Sydney. I think so. Ah, there we go. So make sure that I'm picking the right one. Just before I open it up, I'll minimize. Oh, I guess I can't do that. Sorry, 2 years into the pandemic, and I'm not quite sure how to use the technology still. So wrong one. This is the one that I would like to share. So members of the committee can let me know if they can see that screen. There should be a Word document up.
Yes.
Okay. So this chart, Mr. Chair, is a summary of the chart that you had up previously, and what it does in the left-hand column is lists the various topics that had been assigned to Planning Committee by Council, and then the recommended next steps. So what Council members will sort of see is matters that are being referred to Council. So for example, the site alteration bylaw, as well as the educational materials, condominium road standards, trailer park site plan. The matters that were being referred to the Waterfront Policy Review, which includes undersized islands, the definitions of waterfront lots, policies around the lifting of the H2 zone, provisions relating to docks and provincially significant wetlands or type 1 fish habitat, environmental impact assessment terms reference, I'll use that term, as well as the definition of navigable waterways. And matters that were left for committee to consider were shoreline platforms, building heights, site plan control bylaw, notification policies, and walkway definitions. And my recollection of the conversation, although I don't have the minutes in front of me of our meeting in November, was that Planning Committee at that time reaffirmed their view that the remaining items to be considered by committee were of importance, I would sort of say. I think there was a ranking exercise. I don't recall the results of the ranking exercise, but my general recollection is that all of these items were important to committee. And to Beth's earlier point, that the committee wanted to have an opportunity to consider these matters as it moved forward in this term of committee. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. Chair.
So thank you for that. I guess one of the challenges that I will share, and this is from input provided to me prior to the meeting, is for example, the site alteration bylaw was approved a couple of years ago and was routed back to council for action, or sorry, staff to act for action, and no action has been taken. And so it was suggested to me that we may want to do something to encourage staff and council to take action on that, given that it's been outstanding for a while. Approved by Planning Council, but outstanding with no further action. And excuse me, I think that might be a useful thing to consider. If I could go on, and actually what you're listing here is actually fairly consistent with the other listing that we had. But I think there are a couple items that were referred back to committee. The items that are shown in the waterfront policy review, I think there are a couple of items that we may want to consider handling in a parallel way, because I guess there's there's some what I'll call it housekeeping requirements in one area that that may be kind of out of not need to be part of the scope of the waterfront policy, so that the waterfront policy review can make more progress. And I'm kind of doing a lot of babbling here, but if I could show my screen one more time, I think I could give you a fairly crisp understanding of what I'm getting at here. And this relates to the undersized islands matter. And Cindy, can I still share my screen? Okay, so we'll find okay, so in the come on, I'm sharing my screen, but I'm not seeing my screen. Okay, so in the topic of undersized islands, there are lots of examples, and if you'll bear with me, I'm going to start off with Island 195, which is just off Star Island, and this, by the way, is a district zoning map. So Island 195 is the old name. 2 Island 1690 is the new name. It's an acre, and it's been determined by the courts that it can never be developed, but it's got a zoning of SRI 2-1. And according to some input that I've been able to get from others in our community, having some other designation showing no possible development on that island would be much more appropriate. So the courts have already ruled on it. And I guess what I'm getting at, and I'll kind of direct this comment to Jason, there are a bunch of these kinds of things out on the bay that wouldn't likely bubble up in your review, but the community are extremely well aware of these things and want them dealt with, and they are kind of hangovers from the 9119 bylaws to the 1475 bylaw, where things weren't always brought forward with the correct intent or the zoning. So that's one example that I'll highlight. And I'm not sure that any SR type zoning that would give the owner of that property a belief that there is some ability to develop that property in the future makes any sense, given the fact that our township's already invested over, I think, $300,000 or so in legal fees dealing with that particular island and kind of battling it through the courts. So I'd like to talk about another island, but before I do that, welcome any comments or input on that type of situation. Okay, so the other example that I wanted to highlight is we have a property here, and the property that, if assuming you can see what I'm hovering over, this property also owns this island over here. And this island is designated as, well, first of all, it's got a name of 2 Island 2350. It's half an acre.
Sorry,
and,
I don't think you're showing the correct screen unless I can't see it.
Yeah, no, we can't see it either, Alan.
Okay. So I'm doing all this talking and nobody can see me.
Yeah, what I see on my screen, Al, is the essentially the Excel file with the listing.
Okay, what are you seeing now?
There we go.
An island.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so apologize for that, but hopefully you'll understand the wording. Certainly the Island 195 has been a longstanding issue within the township. What I'm getting at here, assuming you can see this, this island right here, which is 2 Island 2340. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so that island and this island up here are both owned by the same person. But this island up here is a separate island. It's got ½ an acre in size. And if we scroll through, we see it's zoned SRI 7. And so the comments that I'm getting from the community, certainly up in Cognachine, are this is an island that seems to have fallen out of the 9119 zoning and been miszoned, if you will, in the 1475 zoning, because a ½ acre island is not a candidate for development. But what I also wanted to point out is if you look at this island here, it's got a very small isthmus here. It's possible that in high water, this island is actually 2 islands. So that's another potential concern. We have lots of those examples out in the bay. And if my screen paints, I will scroll up here.
I'm on video.
Okay, so this is another anomaly that I'll point out. The cluster of these 3 or 4 islands that you see that are green hashed islands. If we look at those, the good news is they're not zoned as a developable island,
I can't get
but
that to.
they are. And Beth, you're not on mute if you want.
No, I know. I'm having problems. Sorry, I can't see your screen and I can't see to unmute. There's nothing here to. I apologize.
Okay.
I can't see the screen. Okay, now I can mute. Sorry, guys.
It's okay. But this is Zoom is wonderful, but the technology challenges sometimes can be more challenging than you want. But anyways, what I was getting at here is here we have a situation where we've got an island, but it's not one island. All of these islands are all grouped together and they show 4.3 acres. And so the risk that we have as a township is someone might come to us and say, well, wait a minute, I've got 4.3 acres and you zoned this property natural state island, but I got 4.3 acres. But in fairness, you don't have 4.3 acres. You have several individual islands. And I think that certainly with the feedback that I'm getting from the community, anomalies like this probably need some discussion. And I'm not sure that this is something, Jason, that you want to dive into and resolve all, we'll call these planning anomalies or zoning anomalies. I think what we as a township want you to be doing is reviewing the waterfront policies and focusing on what good policies are and what not good policies are. Whereas these anomalies about the zoning of these islands, which were really left over from the transition from 9119 to 1475, there was a lot of things that fell between the cracks. And all I'm trying to do here is point out examples of a few of those that have come to us or have come to me with people saying, I would like you to bring this up so that the planning committee can understand that. And as we consider that, that may mean that we want to pull some of these island definitions out of the waterfront policy and consider them in a separate process so we can deal with them. They've been, again, the community have been bringing them forward since the beginning of this term of council, and we really haven't made much progress on them. So that may be something that we want to look at separately.
Member Hazelton or Chair Hazelton, I'm wondering if I could just add something to that as well. When we dealt with the undersized islands, and this is when Jamie Robinson was handling this aspect for us, we dealt with the low-hanging fruit. We dealt with the ones that were easy to make decisions on. The township went and consulted with those owners before decisions were made on corrections of zoning, but we didn't deal with the proliferation of multiple islands up and down the shore that had some incorrect zoning to reflect possible development when they were totally undersized and should have been natural state. And I am concerned when I look at what was on our September list, the list that you circulated to the members of the committee last night, and under next steps, it says none. We didn't complete that exercise. So I don't know where the direction is that coming from. It's certainly not coming from this committee, because I'm going to sound like a broken record on this. It's to your word you used earlier. It is a hangover for 2014 when council made the commitment that they would correct this when all of these errors were identified at the last public meeting. So I'm just a little concerned. The direction that appears that from council, based on this list from yesterday, says no action going forward, and we do need to fix some of these things. And I would think that there's various committees that, I'm sorry, coastal members that have input to that through the committee representatives on this committee. And Jason, you wouldn't be familiar. There's so many islands out there. I think you might want assistance from this committee as to which ones are possibly wrongly zoned, and also some input to the policies.
So Jason,
I think
based
if
on
I-
what yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, thank you. And I appreciate Beth's reminder as well, because it takes me back to the conversation that we had in September. And to answer your question, Mr. Chair, I think the examples that you're bringing forward, I think highlight that for me, they reinforce our past discussions, because they're highlighting the potential range and the scope in the waterfront policy review. And I think the feedback that we heard clearly from this committee and from Planning Council as well is, yes, let's initiate the waterfront policy review. The intent of the waterfront policy review is to sort of understand the community's perspectives on development trends, both in the islands and the bay and the inland lakes, with a clear focus on bringing recommendations forward to planning sort of council for decision this term on housekeeping items that would harmonize essentially your bylaw and make sure that the bylaw, there's an ease of interpretation and a greater sort of consistency in the applicability of it. So I know, Mr. Chair, you sort of said this is probably not what you want to be looking at, Jason, in terms of the scope of the waterfront policy review, but these are exactly the examples that we would be looking at through that process, and appreciate you bringing them forward today. And what I would sort of say is, if committee members continue to receive suggestions from the community in terms of things that we can look at, we definitely need to hear them, because the having something, a zone category, not being migrated through multiple zone bylaws as you're sort of changing your bylaw one from another, falls in my mind directly within the bin of a housekeeping item. That is, in my mind, potentially an administrative oversight that has been made that needs to be corrected at this point in time. So I do think these matters fall within the scope of the waterfront policy review. And if I could answer a point that Beth had sort of raised at the outset of the conversation in terms of consultation with this committee, yes, absolutely. Our commitment is to come back to this group through the waterfront policy review process once fully approved by council, and to have these exact discussions and to get your advice and your perspective on kind of what's right for your community.
So thank you for that, Jason. One of the things that may be challenging for you and your team is to find these kinds of anomalies. And I think what the community is asking for, and I'm going to single out Councillor Cooper on this, because he's done an enormous amount of work with previous planning staff to identify a lot of these anomalies and bring them forward. And I can't claim to personally know them, and I don't know if any other members of the planning committee have been actively involved. And so what I think might make sense, and I'm kind of projecting Councillor Cooper's ideas here, but a working session with Councillor Cooper to bring forward a lot of these anomalies so that you don't have to go looking for them might be a really effective way of having a cooperative working relationship. So that might be outside of planning committee. And I guess where I'm going with this is there are likely lots of examples where you and your waterfront policy review could take advantage of that kind of expertise, not just from Councillor Cooper, but perhaps from others, where it doesn't need to be formalized through this committee structure, but could be a huge benefit to you and your team as you're preparing the report. And I'm wondering, is that something that you and your team are open for?
So to you, Mr. Chair, yes, absolutely. And I think the other key differentiator, perhaps in terms of technology for this review versus past planning exercises in the township, is that with the township now entering into a service agreement with the district municipality of Muskoka for a fuller scope of GIS services, we do have the ability to leverage the GIS capabilities of the district to apply a much broader analytical lens to all of the islands and to sort of do almost like a search and sort of look at all of the islands and look at all the zone categories to see what makes most sense for those spaces. So we do have the ability, I think, to leverage that additional technology as well, together with the local knowledge and the local perspective. And I think bringing those two things together will make for a very successful waterfront policy review.
Thank you. Peter, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, I just, I'm a little bit hesitant to interject here because I am new to this committee. But I have been following the development and the discussion about the waterfront policy review. And I just like to throw it out there with respect to Jason's comment and suggestion that we deal with the mapping anomalies and the zoning anomalies as part of the policy, the waterfront policy review. And perhaps that is the intention, but I just question whether, to me as an outside observer, the issue of mapping anomalies is not so much a policy issue as just a matter of correcting errors, and it does fall within the housekeeping, the definition of a housekeeping change. My limited understanding of the waterfront policy review was that it would be looking at certain provisions in the zoning bylaw, definitions and so on, and where there was a discussion about housekeeping amendments, that would be focused on a particular definition that perhaps doesn't meet the requirements that we think it should meet. So I just throw that out there, and as to whether it is or it isn't a good idea to roll the mapping anomalies into the waterfront policy review. It seems, looking at the charts, that it was a separate item, that there was, as Beth says, that this committee and council have partially dealt with that item, but not completed that item. And I'm just wondering if it is in fact the best way to approach it, to roll it into the waterfront policy review.
So Jason, can we put you on the spot again and just have you comment? One of the, if I can just paraphrase a little bit, it's one thing to sort out some of these anomalies and corrections, if you will, but I think one of the drivers for the waterfront policy review was to ensure that we have alignment between the decisions being made by council, planning council, and committee of adjustment, and the planning department. And if the policies weren't in place to allow the planning department to be in sync with the decisions being made by council, planning council, and committee of adjustment, then we needed to understand how to evolve those policies forward. And I think to what Peters has said, that may be a slightly different path than correcting these other anomalies, and maybe we should be trying to find a way to do that in parallel, just because we feel that there's probably a lot to be done and not a lot of runway left in the year to do it.
So to you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate Peter's comment as well. And you're right. When we first sat down to talk about the waterfront policy review last year, we were projecting a June, July completion date, and June, July is around the corner, and we will all feel that acutely in sort of the coming months, and that is fair. I believe so. You are correct. One of the drivers for the waterfront policy review is clearly the feedback and the direction that we've received from council around the intent of the policies and how we can sharpen sort of the zoning and the policies to ensure that intent is sort of clear. But there are other drivers as well. And I think some of the past conversations with this group are clearly a driver to the study. We've had the pleasure of serving as your consultant now for a year, and we have our own perspectives on your planning tools around what works and what doesn't work and what needs to be clarified to sort of make our job in terms of providing advice to council a little bit more sort of efficient and effective, if you will. And I know Dr. Espila certainly has his perspectives as well now, as he sort of comes into, I believe it's sort of the 6 month mark of his tenure as your sort of planning director. So all of those things, together with the sort of the analysis that we've presented in the past, and that's been approved by council, as well as the public consultation process that we intend to undertake, will sort of, our hope is at the outset of the study, we'll bring a series of issues and opportunities, and we'll place those on the table before us. So the list my hope is that the list that we have before us today is actually going to grow as we go through that process. And then together, we're going to sort of work on that list, and we're eventually going to kind of scope it back. And as the methodology that we previously presented would be to sort of say, in the first phase, here's what we can address through housekeeping. And maybe it incorporates mapping changes, maybe it doesn't. Those are decisions to be made down the road based on the information I think that we have before us at that time. And at the same time, some of those things that will be sort of out of scope, the things that we can't change in the short term, those will go into a subsequent phase of work. And through our past conversations, we've talked about the notion of those types of changes being considered as part of an official plan review for the township. So decisions to be made by sort of future council. So I know I'm not perhaps answering the question 100% spot on, but we do have, I think, a very well proven process in place to get the issues on the table, for us to have a conversation around those, to figure out collectively the changes that we'd like to make in the short term, and to sort of set future council up and for success in terms of identifying the things, the continued work that needs to be done to ensure that the townships, both its official plan and its zoning bylaw, and I've used this term before, meets the moment, if you will, to ensure that as development continues within the township, its unique natural environment is preserved for the benefit of both current and future generations.
Okay. We've had a fair amount of chat on this topic, and I don't want to spend all of the time on that one, but if I could kind of summarize a little bit, I think what I'm hearing is there is value in the undersized islands staying within your waterfront policy review, and you are open and receptive to others, whether they be committee members or members of the community who have specific input that would be valuable to your review, to discuss that, review that with them, to make your job perhaps a little bit easier. Is that a reasonable summary? Okay. So there's lots of other items on the list. One of the other items that members of the community have brought to my attention is the environmental impact assessment and fish habitat impact assessment, where there is no terms of reference. And I'm wondering, and I'm going to put you on the spot again, Jason, is this something that you and your team have the environmental and fish habitat expertise to kind of craft standards, if you will, or terms of reference that would be useful, or is this something that through the combination of some of the other consulting organizations we have, where they do have specific environmental and fish habitat and wetland expertise, that we should be relying on them to bring forward a significant core element of that, and then perhaps feed that into your waterfront policy? Could you just comment on that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and I believe so to you, Mr. Chair, the answer is the latter. So that is not an area of expertise that we have in-house at JLR, but the township does have other third-party service providers on staff that do have that expertise. And I know in our past discussions, when Brent Parsons from Hutchinson Environmental Sciences Limited participated in some planning committee discussions, we had always seen Brent and his team sort of leading the impact assessment terms of reference work. So that's a piece that I'm happy to take back to Dr. Espila when he's back in the office next week, and we can talk about that, and whether, I think you're raising a valid point, just sort of whether the correct home there is the waterfront policy review, or we can pursue that work within a parallel stream.
Yeah, and so my ask here really is, to the last point you made, does it make sense to include in the waterfront policy, potentially making that a bigger review, or are these somewhat discrete items that we can leverage the expertise? And certainly Hutchinson Environmental has some of that expertise, but certainly in our community, we've had a lot of work being done by Dr. Patchow Fraser of McMaster University, and council have expressed in very high appreciation and confidence in the work that she has done, and that those sources may be effective paths to, on a parallel vein, move forward on those topics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so to you, Mr. Chair, it does. And by signaling Hutchinson Environmental, I wasn't intending to sort of imply sort of favoritism one way or the other, but there are other third-party service providers that the township has, and let me follow up with Dr. Espila on that. I'm not familiar with the budget that the planning department has at the township, or what Dr. Espila's plans are for sort of implementing the work plan for this year. So I'll have to check in with him, and we'll follow up with additional information.
Okay. So just before I leave that point, comments that have been made to me that I'll just share. We have had a few studies, EIS studies and fish habitat studies recently come to our township for matters that people have needed to have these reports done. And comments have been made that, wow, that's an excellent study. Why don't we just use that as kind of a core example for now as we move towards a terms of reference. So, I mean, 3 years ago, we in council tried to recommend that we have a terms of reference document, and we haven't got there yet, but we have excellent examples. And if somebody were to come to the township and say, okay, so I need a fish habitat impact assessment, give me an example of what a good one was, that even without a terms of reference would be an excellent start. But somehow we seem to be reluctant in doing that. Do you think that's a useful starting point prior to kind of the extra work that might be needed to document a formal terms of reference document?
So to you, Mr. Chair, potentially, yes. We're sort of getting into sort of the administrative aspect of it, but I could see the benefit in the approach that sort of you're describing, but I'm not familiar with the practice that Dr. Aspel is implementing on the development application side as it relates to the natural heritage studies. So I'd have to check in with him on that. But the example that you provide reminds me of an instance in another municipality we're currently working in, where we've been retained specifically to prepare a lake management plan for a very large body of water that is the sole drinking water source for the municipality. And in that particular case, given they've had 10 years of practice now, implementing the policies of their official plan as it relates to sort of protecting the lake sort of from undue development pressures, I would sort of suggest. And they have 10 years of experience now implementing the studies that you described. And what I find interesting in that case is they in fact are taking the best practices from that 10 years of experience now and just enshrining it in policy in terms of mitigative measures to say, we have 10 years of experience, we know what works. So we're going to change our development standards now to increase them because we're very comfortable with these mitigative measures. There'll be subsequent scope studies to deal with matters where we don't have enough certainty yet or enough administrative practice on implementation. So I raise that because your comments remind me of that, and I also raise it because as we go through the waterfront policy review together, there may be instances where we will encounter examples like that, where both this team and planning council feel it appropriate to basically enshrine matters of practice into their policy. And so that's just a sort of sneak preview of a conversation that may come in the next few months.
Can I impose on you, Jason, to share your screen one more time and show us that list again?
Of course, yeah. If you'll bear with me, I can do that.
Because what I'd like us to do as a committee is look at the other items and recognize which ones will still be in our bailiwick, so to speak, and make sure we understand what the essence of those issues are. And that's really what I was trying to do with the waterfront, with the undersized islands matter, is so that we kind of understood what the issues were that we were trying to deal with. So when we're looking at this item, so we've got lifting the hulls, docks in PS1 F1, which probably ties closely to the EIS matters. Navigable water definitions. Let me just pause there before we get down to the other ones and ask members of the committee, are there any of those other items that we haven't yet talked about, down to navigable water definitions, that we have a desire to talk about today or add back into our agenda because we think that there's additional need for us to comment on these things? Beth.
Yes, one of the ones that I've talked about a number of times is the lifting of the hold provision. And when this matter came to our committee before, we were of the understanding that we were going to deal with the H and the H2, the H2 being on the extremely undersized vacant lots. The second part of that exercise never came to this committee. We dealt with those that have an H, and if they met the area and frontage, that maybe there can be a staff procedure to lift the H. But I think the lifting of the H2 provision, particularly for some extremely undersized properties that may be quite environmentally sensitive, is something that we could discuss. And for instance, there's a conflict between the official plan policies surrounding the lifting of the hold and the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw says you just need a survey. But the official plan says you need a survey to determine if it meets a certain threshold of area and frontage to be considered for development. And one of the things that I noticed in an appeal that I was personally involved with, and the outcome of that, is that the minimum threshold to be, quote, considered for development is 50 meters of frontage and 0.4 hectares of area. That minimum lot size, for instance, would never have applied to perhaps Cognisheen, Wawatasi, Go Home. It might have been a minimum in Honey Harbor at some point in time, but certainly not in some of the outer communities. So I think part and parcel of that should be a discussion is, what is the minimum threshold of lot and area that should be, what is the threshold for which you can be considered for development? Then, of course, you go to the next stage on the various studies that you determine appropriateness of development. So that is certainly one that I always had thought would come back to our committee. It was supposed to come to our committee, and it did not. docks in FH1 and PHW, I apologize for my dog. That was a two-part exercise, but the second part was never dealt with our committee. We looked at docks in existing developed properties where subsequent to their development, it may have been zoned PSW or FH1, and we felt that those docks should be allowed to be replaced. But what our committee never did discuss was our docks in PHW and FH1 zones, if they occupy the entire frontage, for instance, permissible or even appropriate on a lot that is entirely sensitive along its shoreline. So I always thought that was to come back to our committee. That would be another one. And navigable waterway definitions, being on a waterfront property, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the waterfront lot definition. Water access properties need to have water access to get to them to develop and to maintain those systems. And quite honestly, it was very discouraging when a particular municipal planner said, as long as you can get to a property by a canoe or kayak, it's considered a navigable waterway. The truth is, in the coastal communities, you need to have access in all water level conditions. You have to be able to get a construction barge in to construct. You need a barge in to pump out and maintain a septic system over the life of that development, and water levels do fluctuate. So those are some of the key matters that I've been sort of driving at. There should be an appropriate avenue to discuss those in our committee.
So, thank you. Any other comments about some of these other items? Jason, can I put you on the spot again?
Of course, yes.
So if I can interpret the concern, it's these are matters that the committee had been assigned, and there's certainly a noticeable amount of interest in dealing with these topics, and perhaps there's a little bit of a concern that they're lobbed over the wall into this policy review, waterfront policy review, and then we lose opportunities for input. And so perhaps the feeling good about leaving them in the waterfront policy review would be you helping us understand how your interactions will take place with the planning committee or members of the planning committee on these topics going forward, so that the expertise and the thoughts that have been in the minds of the planning committee are incorporated into your overall study. Does that make sense?
So to your chair, yes, it does, and I can certainly sort of feel, and we feel it as well, the desire to sort of proceed with the study. And I think, as we've talked about in the past, we see this group as a tremendous resource for the waterfront policy review. And effectively, I think everyone appreciates what we've done in the last few months is taken a lot of the, I want to call them disparate threads, but threads in the conversation of planning around in the waterfront areas, and we put them into a more holistic study process. And my expectation is we'll be meeting with the committee on a monthly basis to talk about the waterfront policy review. So if I were to disconnect the waterfront policy review from your meeting schedule, we would be there to help kick the study off. We'd come to you at the end of our background research phase to check in, get your feedback on that. We'd come to see you when we've got our thoughts together on what the recommended directions are to test those with you, and then ultimately on the draft changes themselves. If I'm to take that generic process and I'm to layer it onto your meeting schedule, assuming that we receive positive direction from council to proceed in March, is that we will be probably occupying a considerable portion of your agenda in April, May, June, and potentially into July as we work through this process together. So I would expect, my hope and my expectation for the waterfront policy review and this committee's role is that we'll be spending those 4 meetings together talking about these very issues. And I think from my perspective now, it's just a matter of getting there to the starting line and sort of getting out of the starting blocks, if you will.
Beth, does that help with your desires for input?
Absolutely, it does. It just, the chart was a little misleading because it said further input from planning committee. No, 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 no. I'm hearing from Jason that you will be you're talking with us about the policies as they're being developed, I hope. So that would be helpful, along the lines of what we've been talking about, the undersized islands, with having some discussion as well. I am a little concerned about the time, because if you don't get authorization till March to commence, and given what your original timeline was for the waterfront policy area review to be complete, I'm cognizant of the fact there's a number of these things that really have been hanging out there unresolved for an awful long period of time. I'd hate them to be put into the waterfront policy and then find out we don't get to deal with that in this term of council. And then by the time things ramp up, it's next summer again. So that's the only concern. So maybe, Jason, if I could make a request, is as you work through the individual aspects of what's on this list, that they come to, and that you come in a staged way on those individual items versus coming to us with the whole waterfront policy, and then we don't have a chance to delve into the particular topics on this list. So if I could make that request, that would be helpful.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Chair, appreciate that. Beth, I think, you know, if you knew me as well as other people do, you know that I'm an eternal optimist, but in terms of timing, I would say that I too am getting concerned about the time that we have remaining to do the sort of study. I will take your request under advisement. I need to think about how we would sort of operationalize that, Beth. Because in the process that I'm describing, everything is coming together at the same time. So the implication of that then being that in order to delve into these subjects as deeply, as deep as the committee wishes to, that these meetings will take longer in order to go through those, and we'll have to be very well facilitated to ensure that we're all on point. We have the ability to sort of, examine, reflect, debate, discuss the matters under consideration, and sort of give council the best advice that we can collectively. So appreciate the sentiment, but let me think about that a little bit, and I'll confer with Dr. Espila when he's back in the office next week, but certainly appreciate the desire. And, to your point around the no, I think that's partly also why we moved away from that table, Beth, because that was, the no is all about procedure, bylaws, and that sort of thing. But the practical reality of the waterfront policy review is that to set the community up for success and to set council up for success, that's something that we'll be collaborating on together. And that's our commitment.
Great.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Could I just make a sort of a general I guess maybe a feedback comment? I guess what I'm getting from this, of course, I'm not on the Bay, so, a lot of these issues, quite a few of them are focused on the Bay. So I apologize for not really being attuned to them. But what I'm sort of sensing is maybe we started off with a notion that it was kind of all or nothing. We were going to continue to deal with an issue, or it was going to be handed off to the waterfront policy study. And if I kind of picked up on what the chair was saying at the beginning is, does that have to be that way? Or can it be, can the planning committee still advance some aspects of this while it's still being dealt with, in the policy review study? And, as an example, on undersized islands, for example, what strikes me is what's important for the policy study is to get a clear notion of where difficulties arise because of definitional sort of deficiencies, or where there's policy ambiguity. And then, that's kind of leading to problems of really sorting out which islands are undevelopable and which aren't, and sorting out the zoning. So, to the extent that that's, if those issues are already clear, then that easily feeds into the policy review study. And it leads to sort of saying, well, we've got policy issues to straighten out. We've got definition issues to straighten out, as opposed to it just being, something that's clear, and we just need the staff resources to get on and deal sort out the different island categories and so on. And what I'm sort of discerning is there are definitional aspects and policy ambiguities that are a problem, and those seem to belong in the policy review study. But if, for example, if somewhere along the way Jason said, well, these policy confusions aren't quite clear, can the planning committee do a bit more work and look at a few more examples to sort of clarify where the problems are? Like, I see that as, maybe being an opportunity to sort of say, well, everything can't be unpacked in the policy study, and we might still need the planning committee and I guess township staff to work forward on some details. For example, maybe the next stage of undersized islands as an example. So I don't know if that helps, but I guess I'm responding to the kind of notion that, I don't think a lot of these things are all or nothing. I think from the policy review, we need feedback. Like if the policy issues and the definition of issues aren't clear now, then maybe that requires some further work by the committee to help the policy review study. Anyway, that's sort of what I'm discerning here. I guess I'm sort of reacting to the notion that it has to be, all in the study or altogether not in the study, and suggesting that, you need to sort of work between staff resources and committee, and the committee, and then what can fit in the study. So I don't know, that's sort of my general impression of what I'm listening to, I guess.
Jason, did you want to comment on that?
So thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, and apologies, my phone is ringing and it's slightly distracting me because it's very loud. But I agree with Bill, and I think that's why we have sort of set up the two-phase process that we have. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, we're going to go and we're going to put a whole bunch of issues on the table. Some will be able to address through the housekeeping amendment. So it's a policy review with a housekeeping amendment as a phase 1 outcome. And then it has other phase 2 outcomes. So some of those phase 2 outcomes could be referred to an official plan review. Some of those issues that get put on the table could be referred back to planning committee for further investigation, further consultation, further analysis. So there's a couple of different homes for the longer term issues where they may reside. But because we haven't initiated the study yet, we don't know the full scope of the issues that we're dealing with, although I think we all have a pretty good sense individually of what the issues are. But as soon as we get the issues on the table, then we can map them and we can determine, okay, to Beth's point, what are low-hanging fruit? What can be addressed through housekeeping amendments? Let's get some changes made. What needs to be referred into sort of longer and more deeper analysis and processes. So I think Bill has raised a really good point and agree with what he's saying.
Bill, does that make sense for you?
Yeah, no, and Jason rightly points out, I'd sort of forgotten the piece about, the study leading to some housekeeping, immediate sort of housekeeping, amendments and so on, to fix up some immediate problems. So I think that all ties in there, and I think the planning committee sort of becomes a bit of a sounding board or input. Also provides input to the study in helping to clarify. I mean, we've sort of looked at a lot of these issues, and I think, to the extent that the study needs to sort of clarify what the issues are going into the study, if we have to do a bit more work or have a more discussion as committee to help refine that, then, that I see that as something that can take place. And, it isn't just a message like, leave all this stuff alone and, don't get involved at all until the study is underway or concluded. So, yeah, I agree with what Jason said there.
Yeah, so just as a kind of a little bit of a summary point, there's a lot of passion and interest by not only the committee members, but also the members of the community to weigh in on these things. And the concept of, I think Beth pointed it out, no more involvement for the planning committee. It's lobbed over the wall to the waterfront policy review. That kind of scares a lot of people because people don't want to continue to be involved. And what I'm hearing from you, Jason, is that you understand that and that you are going to be seeking ways to continue to involve both the planning committee, and it will be open to other individual members of the community to complement your process so that we get to a better place probably sooner than we might have. Am I putting words in your mouth, or is that fair?
No, you're not putting words in my mouth, Mr. Chair. In fact, what I would sort of say, a definition of failure for this project would be for me to go through a review in isolation and stand before council at the end of my own professional review and to say, here are my recommendations. A definition of success would be to do that in collaboratively with this group and with the community, and together bring collective advice to council on sort of our best thoughts on what to do for planning in the waterfront areas. So it's I don't think you're putting words in my mouth at all. No.
Okay, thank you for that. If I could, I wanted to blast forward to several of the other topics that are all listed as committee next steps, and I'm going to categorize them into two areas. One is short. The first category is related to building. So we have short platforms, building heights, and walkway definitions. Those are all, according to Jason's list, left with the committee. And unfortunately, Armin isn't here. I think he was kind of the driver of many of these. And so I'm not quite sure which of those he would consider to be his number one priority. Let me ask members of our committee, do any of you have strong opinions on each of those items as to where they should be high priority, low priority for next steps for the committee?
Sorry, Al, could you repeat the three items again? Because I don't have the list in front of me.
Sorry. So the items are shore platforms, building height, and walkway definition.
Oh, and the other was notification policies. There were 4.
No, there are other items there.
Okay.
Those were the development related topics. Other topics were the site plan control bylaw and notification policies. Those were the other 2 items that were left with committee assignment, if you will, recommended next steps. And but what I was just trying to do is separate them into 2 pots. One pot being the development items, the other pot being the what we'll call more committee type topics, the site plan control bylaw, where we've had lots of input from independent lawyers involved with site plan controls and recommendations to the township, and then notification policies so that we ensure that we're notifying people of interest. But I thought in my head anyways that those were a little bit separate from the development issues of shore platforms, building height, and walkway definitions. So I guess what I'm trying to get to here is we probably want to prioritize some of these items, maybe one block or the other block, and ask staff to help us with the next agenda and have us dive into those topics in earnest for the next agenda. And I'm not quite sure where the development topics fit with respect to the site plan control and notification policy in other people's mind. And Peter, you want to weigh in on it? So please go ahead.
With respect to the 3 items that fit under the category of buildings or structures, from my personal perspective, I think the shore platforms is something that I think needs to be addressed. And I think I'm personally very confused about the difference between a shore platform, a deck, a shore dock, a dock, and I think people maybe use the terms interchangeably sometimes. And I think some clarity on those definitions would certainly be helpful.
Okay, so as a committee, we should perhaps have those on our agenda and use them as discussion points to help clarify or to work with the definitions we have and then offer recommendations on where definitions may need to be modified. Is that really where you're going, Peter? I'll take silence as a yes.
So, sorry, my phone was ringing in the background and I didn't catch all of that. But
Okay. All I was trying to say is the short platforms, building height and walkway. If I'm interpreting your comments, as a committee, it would be helpful to perhaps review the current definitions and then through discussion, provide recommendations back to staff and council on where those definitions may need to be tweaked or modified to be more clear or more reflective of what is appropriate.
yeah,
Is that okay? So Sydney, could we ask you, do we need a motion for that? Or can we ask you to put those on the agenda for discussion for sure next time? And then those will be, the definitions will be available for review, and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss them. Is that, can we ask you to do that, or do we need something else?
We don't need a resolution unless you're requesting staff to look into something further, but if you just want it on the agenda as discussion, then I can have that on the agenda for next month.
Mr. Chair, just for clarification, then, are you basically saying that, perhaps at the next meeting or very soon, we would look at all three of these in terms of their definitions, and then that discussion would lead to prioritizing, say, these three matters for, to actually deal with them and change the definitions, et cetera? Is it sort of a preliminary discussion on all three, and then try and prioritize?
If in the context of a meeting, if we have an opportunity to review, discuss, and recommend, I don't see why we would need to prioritize. There's only 3 items, and I think one of the objectives of our monthly meetings was to be able to bite off chunks that we could potentially handle in an individual meeting, so that we could have that discussion and provide recommendations going forward. And if those 3 are aligned well enough to be sort of common, then maybe it makes sense to try to bite off those 3 and go forward with them. Is that what you're asking?
Sorry, yeah, thanks for the clarification. So you're talking about let's tackle all 3 and move on with them, at a subsequent meeting. Thank you.
Beth?
I was just going to ask if we could talk about building height again. We have had the discussion, and some examples were presented to this committee, and this was when Victoria was involved, and she says, guys, I get it. I'll come back with a suggested definition. We've not seen anything, but Jason, you wouldn't have had necessarily the benefit of the discussion that took place at that particular planning committee meeting. So I'm wondering whether building height is a discussion to come back, because where you calculate it and the proportion to the building and how you calculate it and how you average it. You could have a building, and which we've seen, that was 11 meters tall, but 2 measurements were taken to a single story element tacked to the side, but it doesn't negate what the impact is of the overall height of the building. So there needs to be another or better way of defining how to calculate height when you've got various elements of a building at different heights. So I would like to have that discussion again. Or if Jason has any ideas, because if you pull the definitions from your standard bylaw, it doesn't always apply. And I mean, I'm talking about particularly in a flat roof, and this was a very contemporary design, Jason. So you were measuring right to the top of that roof. So that would be my request, to have another discussion on building height.
Okay, so why don't we, I'm not quite sure how much we can accomplish in one meeting, but if we were to put those 3 on the agenda for the next meeting and try to review and come up with recommendations that would be a great accomplishment. If we can't get through all three, then we could start off with the three and see where we get, and then put the whatever isn't accomplished over to the next meeting. But then the question is, if we take that approach and we're going to deal with those items, the two other key items, site plan control bylaw and notification policies, are we okay with sliding that back for another meeting or two, or do people think that that's a higher priority, it should be dealt with sooner? Yes.
I would like to have another discussion on the site plan control and what authority the municipality has in every instance to implement through site plan control. So sometimes it's used as a tool to control things that were never meant to be controlled in a site plan bylaw. So I would add that to the list.
So it will be on the list. The question I'm really asking here is, does it need to be in the next meeting, or can it be on a subsequent meeting? In other words, what is the sense of urgency of dealing with that compared to these other three items that we've just kind of surfaced? Is it okay to leave that for the next meeting after the next one? In other words, 2 meetings out, or do you think it's got a higher priority?
I would say it had a higher priority personally.
Others, comments? What we're trying to do here is prioritize these 5 outstanding items so we can make sure that our next meeting has the top priority items that we want to deal with before we move on to other items.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'm just looking at the sort of the next steps and notes, let's say specific to the building height. It refers to, and this is, I guess it was as of September 24th of last year, it says staff to prepare a report to discuss options for measuring building height and also how to incorporate dormer into measurement. Has some of these things been done and we just need to review sort of the staff recommendations and staff sort of definitions? Or are we sort of starting from scratch here and working through this sort of as a committee? But it did look like, looking at this chart, that there's certain elements that the staff was to perform way back in September of last year. But where are those sort of things now? And can we use those as the resource as we move forward with the discussions on building height, shoreline platforms, walkways? There wasn't even any discussion, it looks like, in terms of next steps. But has there been any work done by staff?
I haven't seen any documentation on that. That may, well, that and site alteration bylaw, for example, were tasks that were assigned back to staff or council, and we haven't got an update from that process. So to your point, if we don't have the material regarding recommended new ways of dealing with the building height for taking into consideration the kinds of items that Beth has highlighted, perhaps we defer that and not put pressures on staff to necessarily produce that for the next meeting, and we focus on site plan control instead.
Yeah, because my concern is on some of these sort of specific items that we're not implementing the policies. We're just making recommendations, and those who are implementing the policies, I think, have to, be part of the process, and I think have to understand and put a means of measurement of, let's say, building height that can be easily interpreted by them. So I think maybe a deferral of some of those items might be appropriate until we get, I think, some input from staff who really are the ones who are going to execute these recommendations that are coming out of this committee.
So perhaps what we need is, and I don't want to push a lot of resolutions, but Sydney, maybe what we need here is a resolution asking council and staff to provide us with the recommendations and diagrams related to building heights and shore and whatever topics may have been necessary, or whatever material may have been necessary for shore platforms and walkways, so that we can have that material, digest it before the meeting, and have come to the meeting prepared to talk about it. Is that something that you recommend we should put a resolution for, to ask for that, or is a less formal process appropriate?
I have a hard time commenting on it right now without Dr. Spilla being here. It would be nice if he was here just to put some direction towards it. I don't know if that's something he's wanting to proceed with, or if that's something they're already working on. You said that back in September that was discussed. Was there a resolution passed for that? Previously for staff to work on it, or?
Yeah.
If
Yes.
so, then it wouldn't be necessary to pass another resolution. I could gather that old resolution and send it to Dr. Espilla with the notes from today's meeting and just keep them informed on what the committee discussed today. But if the resolution was already passed, I don't think it's necessary to pass another resolution today.
Okay. So go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I was just going to say to Ian's point, I would normally agree that we don't need to discuss this again, but we haven't seen anything from staff, and all of the things that were identified as concerns with the existing definition and how it's being implemented, the current staff would have not been party to that. So I recall Brad Oster was in that meeting, Victoria Lemieux was in that meeting. So that's the only reason that I would suggest another discussion is to review that again with new players who will be preparing the new definition or calculations of how you determine height.
Okay. Peter?
If I can make a suggestion, given the uncertainty as to sort of what's been referred to staff, what their timeline is on getting back to us, maybe if it's possible for you, Al, to between now and our next meeting, have a discussion with Dr. Aspla, try and identify which of these items has been referred to staff and get some kind of a timeline on it. And then for the next agenda, it sounds like there's no point in us putting an item on the agenda that has been referred to staff and that we don't have a response on. So maybe the next agenda can include items that either haven't been referred to staff or have been, and we have something to deal with.
Excellent suggestion. So Sydney, I can hopefully work with you and Dr. Espilla to gather that information, and that will be helpful in preparing the agenda for the next meeting. And perhaps that kind of similar approach applies to the site plan control bylaw and notification policies. I suspect that the site plan control bylaw is potentially a heavier matter with legal implications and others, where we may want to review what we have today, but we may also want to review some of the insights that have been provided to us, to the township, from one of the resident kind of planning legal experts, so that we have an opportunity to digest that prior to the meeting. I'm not sure that there's a lot of staff effort required to prepare us for that, to prepare us for a discussion. But Beth, you wanted to weigh in?
I was just going to say the opinion piece that you're referring to was circulated to members of this committee in the past. So maybe in preparation for another meeting on that, all that's necessary is to circulate an opinion piece and perhaps what the current practice is of the township.
Yes. So Sydney, I'm assuming you have it if it was circulated previously, but if you don't have it, talk to me and I will arrange for you to get it. Alrighty. Time is flying by. I'm sure some of you thought that this was going to be a short meeting. I'm delighted that we've had an opportunity to dig in these items because what I've heard from some of you and from some of the community is this committee is important in what we can provide in the way of an opinion. And we don't want to kind of let time fly by when we could be discussing things. And Peter, you wanted to say something again?
Just quickly, if the document that Jason showed us, the who is going to do what document, I'm going to call it, if that could be circulated to the other members of the committee, that'd be great.
So Sydney, is that a yes? Yes.
I'll obtain it from Mr. Farragon and circulate it.
Okay.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, to interrupt, but Sydney, it's been quite a while since I've looked at the zoning bylaws official plan for the township. I believe I sent, I think it was Karen, my address in Brampton. Is there a way that a copy of the zoning bylaw and official plan can be mailed to my address so that I have a reference and I don't have to sort of print out a couple hundred pages at my office?
I'll work with our planning department to try and figure something out, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Beth?
Actually, I was just going to say at the very start of this committee, the township did circulate a lot of the zoning bylaw, existing zoning bylaw, provincial policy statements, the district official plan, so that we had those references handy in print form. Not everybody wants print, but some do. So there was a precedent of the township having provided that documentation to members of this committee before. That's all I wanted to say.
I don't have a big enough briefcase to carry all this stuff. Okay, I think we've pretty much covered the item list and try to prioritize it and understand where we can go next. Are there, that was the only other, that was the only item of new business. Before we wrap that up, are there any other additional comments that someone wants to make on that topic before we seek to wind up the meeting?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was just looking at the chart. Maybe staff can go through because there's items referring to, let's say, in the definition of waterfront lot, it said township initiated housekeeping zoning bylaw amendment and OPA required. But maybe sort of update those next steps and notes because they're not current any longer. It refers to a public meeting scheduled for April 20th for the docks in provincially significant wetlands in FH1, delayed due to COVID. Has there been any sort of review or thought of when is that public meeting expected at this point? It's really, I think, just sort of updating some of those elements in that chart for that are more staff related.
So if I could weigh in on this, I think what would be helpful is that chart was useful, but it is out of date. And there were expectations, for example, that public meeting, in April 2020, and here we are in 2022. But we've also seen many of those items folded into the waterfront policy review. So the action items that might have been considered are no longer considered. And so perhaps through Sydney, we can ask for that grid to be updated to reflect kind of the current state and make it easier as we're digesting it. So the grid that Jason shared is nice and simple. It's binary. It's either waterfront policy review or it's committee. But somewhere between the grid that Jason shared and the attachment from the September 2021 meeting, where it had all kinds of detail, I suspect that much of that detail is no longer valid and useful, and that other than the links, of course, the links that define some of the detail behind those items, But if we could get a perhaps a simplified grid similar to what Jason had with a few extra elements of it, that might make it easier for us to navigate our path forward. Jason, did you want to add comment on that, or is that does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Any other?
Jason, but I don't hear a voice.
He was saying yes, I think.
Yeah, no, I saw the nod.
Sorry,
and-
Eden, I was nodding, yes.
Quite all right.
Okay. If there are no other items to discuss here, then what I would ask is that we have a motion to adjourn. And the motion would read, be it resolved, the planning committee is now adjourned at 11:47 until March 25th, or at the call of the chair. Can I have a mover? Peter, and a seconder, Jack, and all in favor. And carried. And thank you all for today's planning committee meeting, and look forward to chatting with you again on the 25th. And thank you for your support for me being chair.
Welcome, Peter and Ian.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
It's good to be here.
Have a good
Bye.
weekend.